So there's quite a lot to cover, and so I'm just going to kind of cover a little bit of everything. But within this presentation, there are these little orange boxes, and they have suggested web links. Excuse me. There's obviously many other web links out there that you could go to, but they're just a kind of like a jumping off point. I mean, not literally. You're obviously not going to literally jump off a PowerPoint link, but you can copy and paste them into your web browser and then find out more about that particular topic. Please, if my computer fan is too loud, please someone tell me, because I can put on headphones and then you won't be able to hear it. I know that sounds a bit odd, but just if there are any issues like that, please let me know right away. I have a lot of experience of doing Zoom sessions, but obviously I'm not you in the audience, so I'm not getting any feedback of what it actually sounds like. So any sort of whirring or staticky noises, anything like that, just let me know. And also I went for like a dull yellow background, but if that's distracting, I can, you know, change it to a white background or my normal background. So anything like that that you need from me, if I'm speaking too fast, please let me know and I can slow down. I'm not sure if there's captioning that's available, but if it is, it'll be at the bottom of the screen, I should think. So who am I? So as Abby kindly said, so I was an honorary research associate at UCL. I think that's over now. But there we go, live transcription, closed captioning is available, there we go. So at the top of the screen, I think if you click on that, you should be able to see it. And hopefully I won't speak too quickly. If I'm speaking too quickly for it, please someone unmute themselves and tell me so that I can slow down. So I don't think I'm an honorary research associate anymore, but I definitely enjoyed my time at UCL. I was part of CREA, the Centre for Research in Autism and Education, and it was really Liz Pilicano, who used to be the director of CREA, who really got me that work, and it was really fantastic to be able to work within such a great institution. So I'm really delighted to be able to help you to make it even better. So I've written 3 books, the Autism Friendly Guide, the Independent Woman's Handbook for Super Safe Living on the Autistic Spectrum, which isn't just for women, but it's about safety. The Autism Friendly Guide to Periods, which is self-explanatory, it's about periods. And the Autism Friendly Guide to Self-Employment, again self-explanatory, it's about self-employment. I have a co-host a BBC podcast with Jamie Knight called 1800 Seconds on Autism. There are, I think, like 30 episodes or something on the BBC Sounds player, so if you were interested in finding out more about particular topics, then that might be a good starting point to hear someone else's perspective. I'm also a musician. I run a night called Robyn's Rocket, well, a series of gigs basically. They're not always at night. So yeah, so that's who I am. So just to remind everyone, I mean, I'm sure you already know this, but when you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Everyone is different, just as you wouldn't expect all non-autistic people to be the same. Like, for example, if you said something like, oh, well, you're a man, so you're going to like football, you know, that's kind of sexist, isn't it? That's like making an assumption about somebody based on their gender and assuming that everybody of that gender likes the same things. So it's really important just to bear that in mind, that everyone is their own individual person, and autism affects every single person differently. And then on top of that, you know, the interaction with the person's personality, and if the person has co-occurring conditions, so other conditions, for example ADHD or dyslexia, as well as being autistic. And sometimes those conditions won't be diagnosed, so it's really important. And I mean, this presentation, I've designed it to try and cater for both workplaces and relationships, and by that I was thinking about, you know, like boss and colleague, and you know, friendships, like a range of relationships. So you know, obviously you've got to adapt these things to your own personal context, but just really be aware that somebody might have a co-occurring condition as well as being autistic, and you might not know about it. They might not know that it has a name, and so everyone's kind of on this journey of learning these things often, and particularly in women, it can be very difficult to get diagnoses of autism, particularly because quite often women are first diagnosed with particularly borderline personality disorder, but other mental health conditions first, like an eating disorder or OCD. And it's not to say that they can't have those conditions as well as being autistic, but if you have the autism diagnosis, you know, like that's your starting point as a clinician working with somebody, then that can often influence how you provide support and treatment to a person, like in a medical setting, but also within the workplace. I think it's important just to have that in your mind that, okay, this person, they think differently, and I need to understand how this person thinks. And I think if we did that for everybody, including non-autistic people, I think we'd live in a better world, because we'd understand how each person thinks about things, like how their mind works, and we'd be able to utilise different people's skills. As an example, so one of the skills I have is that I'm quite good at technology. I learn quite quickly new technology, and that's meant that actually over lockdown I got some work working with an arts organisation to help implement new technology, because I could learn it very quickly. So that was a skill that I had, whereas, you know, there are lots of skills I don't have. So, you know, perhaps in future doing an away day or a series of activities, like a kind of more facilitated workshop around identifying people's strengths and also their weaknesses, and how you can work together as a team of colleagues or as a group of friends to mutually support one another. That might be a useful thing. So, autism is a autism is a neurodevelopmental disability. Not everybody sees it as a disability, so I suppose the word is condition. It's a neurodevelopmental condition. It means that the brain has developed differently when compared to non-autistic people. That's certainly not to, you know, that not every autistic person sees autism as a disability, and indeed there are a lot of very talented people who feel that autism is a big part of that. If you're particularly interested in the neuroscience of autism, Dr. Eric Cochane from the University of California in San Diego does a lot of work around looking at the differences between non-autistic and autistic brains, so that might be something you'd be interested in. So really I've put this just in the slide pack because I thought that this might be something that would interest you, but I want to focus more on practical things. So you, as I said, you know, the PowerPoint is in the chat, so you can download it and you'll be able to look through this at your leisure, and you'll see that there's several of those jumping off points. And there's stuff about culture, and that's a really important thing, because different cultures see autism in different ways, and so, you know, just as, you know, we're now mindful about how we talk about different kinds of people, like different races of people, different religions, different sexualities, different genders. It's the same with culture. When we talk about autism, that we have to bear in mind the cultural context of that person. So for example, if you grew up in Libya and you moved here as a child, it wouldn't be normal for you to make eye contact with adults unless you were being told off. So when people assess someone to work out whether they're autistic or not, one of the things that they pay attention to is eye contact. However, you know, that measure is not culturally sensitive, because it's not considering actually this child grew up in Libya and now they're living in the UK, and so culturally it's not appropriate for them to be making eye contact with adults, because within their culture that's seen as rude. And so that kind of thing is quite common amongst the autism community, and it can be a big barrier to people accessing services, but also it can make people feel very alienated, both the families of autistic people, young autistic people, and also the autistic people themselves, because they can feel that their cultural identity is not something that they can that they can sort of embody in the way that other people from the same culture can, because they feel like, well, the society is telling me I have to do these things in a certain way because I have this label. So it's really important to be aware of that. And there is a link there. The National Autistic Society did a project about BAME, and I don't really know why they called it that, because I don't think that's the language that that's, you know, sort of preferred. So, but there is that link there if you want to have a look at it. So autism is not a learning or intellectual disability, and it's important here just to bear in mind. So we have learning difficulties. So learning difficulties are specific to particular areas of learning, like reading and writing. But when we say learning disability or intellectual disability, we're talking more globally, so affecting many areas of learning rather than, say, just affecting reading and writing. So autism is not a learning or intellectual disability. There are people who are autistic and have a learning or intellectual disability. Autism is not a disease. Autism is not a mental illness. As I've said, you can be autistic and have a mental illness as well. And obviously you can be autistic and have a disease. I mean, all human beings can have diseases. So, but autism in itself is not a disease. So it's really just important to just really understand that autism does definitely have specific things it affects, but it's not those labels that I've just discussed. So the autism spectrum. So the autism spectrum isn't just a straight line. So in times gone by, people talked about low functioning and high functioning autism, which is really negative language that autistic people prefer not to use now, because it doesn't really tell you anything about the person, because somebody could be very comfortable in one particular situation and be able to work really well, but then in another situation really struggle. So an example might be that somebody could be very comfortable working at home and, you know, be very effective and join meetings on Zoom or Teams or whatever and be able to, you know, work really well. But then when the person has to work in an office, an open plan office, and it's busy and noisy, the person might find it really difficult to get work done and be distracted and find it difficult to communicate with people on Zoom. So it's so dependent on, you know, in that person's situation, where they are physically and what's going on around them. So rather than like saying high functioning or low functioning, people really have started to sort of understand that there are some commonalities amongst autistic people, and the amount that those commonalities affect somebody varies person to person. So initially we've got three main areas. So this originally people talked about the triad of impairments, and then it got kind of expanded as time went on, but this is like a starting point. So if you've read anything about autism, you might have heard the triad of impairments. It's old terminology, but I've included it because if you've done any reading around autism or any courses on autism, this might have been the language that's been used. So the triad of impairments has communication, and really they're talking about social communication. There are some autistic people that don't speak, and there are some people who do speak, and there are some people who can speak sometimes and not all the time. But really what they're referring to is like literal understanding, like taking things literally, like, oh, it's raining cats and dogs, when actually there aren't any cats and dogs falling out of the sky. What you mean is it's raining a lot. And non-verbal communication, so things like eye contact, reading body language, reading facial expression, that kind of thing. Social imagination, so that's putting yourself in other people's shoes, essentially. I mean, not literally, but it's about understanding what somebody else might be thinking and feeling, what their motivations for the way they behave is, and what the outcomes might be, and we'll talk more about that later. And then social interactions, so an example of that would be like taking criticism, for example. I mean, social interactions, they wide. So as I said, initially this is how they thought that autism affected people. And then later on, people realised that actually autism affects many things, and it varies, like I said, person to person, to how much these things affect a person and how they interact with each other. And there's also a bit of kind of overlap with other conditions. So as an example, sensory issues, very common amongst autistic people. Some autistic people fall into a sort of category of having sensory processing disorder, because of how their sensory processing affects them. A lot of autistic people struggle with emotional regulation and recognition, and that can also overlap with mental illness, like OCD, for example. generalised anxiety disorder, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, PTSD is often thought of like that's something that soldiers have when they come back from war, and that's true, but for some autistic people, there's been some research now that suggests that actually the triggers might be a lot smaller. So it could be bullying or something that goes wrong at the workplace, and that can result in PTSD for that person, and that's why it's so important that we try to understand one another and we try and support each other. Attention, many autistic people have the ability to hyper-focus on something, particularly their special or intense interests, and sometimes that gets very muddled with OCD. So obviously OCD is a mental illness, and it has two components, the obsession and the compulsion. So for example, the obsession might be contamination, and the compulsion might be to wash your hands, you know, like every hour, for example. And that's very different to somebody that is just really interested in trains and just wants to focus on trains, or someone that's really interested in mushrooms and just wants to focus on mushrooms. So it's really just important to be aware that there's a big difference, but sometimes those words get very muddled up and people will say, oh yeah, they're obsessed with this, and they'll sort of link it to OCD, and actually yes, you can be autistic and have OCD, but I don't think that special interests fall into OCD. Some autistic people also have an overlap of having ADHD, and particularly in girls and women, ADHD can look quite different. So ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. You could also have it without the hyperactivity, so attention deficit disorder, and there are many girls and women who don't get diagnosed because it might look slightly different. So the hyperactivity, for example, might not be physically moving around, but it might be stuff that's going on in your head. Also, autistic people often can have like really need routine, and you know, to other people seem quite rigid in the way that they manage the world around them, but actually for them that makes sense, and the world has a lot of information and it's quite overwhelming, and you know, routines and things can be very calming. So again, it's about like understanding the individual person. So I'm now going to go through, I've already spotted a spelling mistake, that's bad, isn't it? I'm going to kind of go through the different kind of issues that a lot of autistic people experience. So with social communication, so non-verbal communication and literal understanding. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop my camera, and I'm going to talk for a minute, but I'm going to turn my camera off, and I'm going to speak in a monotone voice. And what this will do is it will give those of you that are not autistic the opportunity to experience the world in a similar way to how some autistic people might experience it. So although autistic people, yep, they can hear voice tone and see your face moving, they might not know what your facial expressions mean and what your voice tone means. So I'm going to speak for 1 minute about Christmas. Christmas is a time of year. It happens at the end of December. Christmas has a Christmas tree and a big meal. People's families come together. People give presents. People hug each other and sing songs called carols. Christmas time goes on for a few days. People eat cheese and chocolate, and they watch movies on TV. So that's about a minute. I'm going to do it again, but now I'm going to use my voice and my facial expression and my body language. So Christmas is a time of year at the end of December, and it has lots of parts to it, but normally it's when families come together. They have a big Christmas tree, which might be made out of plastic or a real tree. They hang decorations on it. They have a big meal. People eat lots of cheese and chocolate. They watch films on TV, and they spend time together. So hopefully from that you've seen that, you know, you missed a lot of information the first time when you couldn't decipher my body language or my voice tone. And so when you're like talking to an autistic person, it's really important that you say what you mean and you don't rely purely on your voice tone and your facial expression to tell the other person what you mean. So for example, if you're being sarcastic, that could be confusing to an autistic person. And if you're a particularly sarcastic person in general, sorry, there's a police car just gone past. If you're a particularly sarcastic person anyway, you can always say, oh, that's just my sarcasm. But just bear in mind that it might not make sense to all autistic people because everyone's different. And then, so literal understanding, things like, oh, it's raining cats and dogs, or it's, I'll be back in a minute. Do you mean a minute? Because you probably don't. You probably mean like, oh well, I'll be back, in 10 minutes. So if you can be precise with your language and your expectations, that can really help. So if you can avoid saying, oh, I'll just be a tick, I'll be a sec, I'll be a jiffy. Those things are not precise. If you can say, I'll come back to you within 15 minutes, or I'll call you by 5 p.m, or I'll arrive between 2 and 2:30. So it's very, it's not, you're not having to like necessarily do things exactly on time, but you're giving somebody some parameters to work with so that the world seems a little bit more predictable. So a few more pointers. So eye contact can be painful for some autistic people. Like I said, everyone is different. So for some people, eye contact's no problem, and sometimes autistic people learn to mask, which means that they learn to act in a certain way to sort of pass as a non-autistic person. But that is exhausting, and people shouldn't have to feel they have to do that at work, right? Everyone should be able to bring their whole selves to work. They shouldn't have to feel that they've got to pretend to be someone else, because if you allow people to be themselves, then that frees up brain space for them to do the work they do. Like, everybody within your department has got there because they're good at physics, or because, if you come from a different department, because they're good at whatever it is they're good at. So if you can reduce the amount of pressure that people feel to try and pretend to be something they're not and to be accepted for who they are, then that can mean that they can do more amazing things, which ultimately is going to help you make grant applications and increase your QDOS and, increase funding and look better as a department. So it helps everybody. Facial expressions can be confusing, and sometimes non-autistic people think that autistic people don't have empathy because the person's not understanding the facial expression. But I think both autistic people and non-autistic people can learn to say what they mean with their face, but also to ask. I think if you're an autistic person and you're confused by someone's face, I think it's okay to ask. But also you need to have a work culture where it is okay to ask, and you don't have to fear that people are going to be like, oh, they're a bit weird. They're like asking me what my face is doing. It's really important to foster a culture that's really positive for everybody, because ultimately that's going to make the world a nicer place for everyone. And also autistic people's faces might not show the emotion they're feeling. So if something happens at work that's upsetting or distressing, although it might not be distressing to somebody else, if it's distressing for that person, it might not be showing on their face. You have to find a way of talking to somebody. So if you're a line manager, you might agree to ask about emotions with like a scale of 1 to 10, if 1 is totally calm and 10 is really stressed, for example. Social imagination. So social imagination, I think, is a key part to the difficulties that many autistic people face, particularly around being taken advantage of, and that sadly happens a lot, and particularly in women and girls. There's a lot of people that have experienced sexual violence, and it's really important that we help people. Again, we make people feel comfortable. Like, no one should have to go through that, regardless of anything else. No human should have to suffer in that way. And I think that social imagination, or the difficulties with it, can make you very vulnerable to it. So social imagination, like I said before, is understanding somebody else's perspective, what they're thinking and feeling, and what their actions might be, and why they're doing what they're doing. And as it says in this little cartoon, somebody could be thinking something and saying something completely different. And again, maybe at another meeting it might be good to have a session of thinking of some of those examples, because I think that is a really big issue for autistic people, and it makes them very vulnerable. Having said that, so social imagination, part of that is theory of mind, which is what I've been talking about. And Damien Milton points out that actually, autistic people can be often better at understanding other autistic people than non-autistic people are. And so actually maybe the theory of mind problems are, twofold. you know, it's not just autistic people, it's autistic people understanding non-autistic people, but it's also non-autistic people understanding autistic people. Like, it's, you know, it's really important to not just see autism as this, like, a problem. Like, actually, autism is part of you, and there are positives and negatives, and there are going to be different positives and different negatives in each person, and you have to figure out, you know, what the positives and negatives are for you. And also, I think it's really important that, you know, again, talking about culture, that people feel comfortable, that they can be who they are. Like, you're all there on the merit of your work. Like, nobody gets to be a postdoc by not doing the work. You have to do the work to get there. And the same with when you're lecturers or whatever it is that you're doing to work your way up in academia, you actually have to do the work. You can't just kind of sit there and smile. You actually have to do the work. So everyone is there, they've got their, you know, under their own merit, and I think that's really important to remember that. So often the sensory world can be quite difficult for autistic people, and I mentioned earlier that some autistic people have sensory processing disorder, which just means that the way they process their senses is very different, and it causes them problems. Some autistic people don't experience, they wouldn't be described as having a sensory processing disorder, but they may well have problems with senses when compared to non-autistic people. However, their different perception and senses can be very helpful. So when we talk about senses, we often think about touch, smell, hearing, sight and taste. But when we're thinking about autistic people and thinking about creating good working environments for all people, I think it's important that we think about proprioception. So that's the senses of where different parts of your body are in relation to one another, which way up you are, that kind of thing. Vestibular, your sense of balance, and interoception, which is sense of your body's internal things like pain and hunger and that kind of thing. And to learn more, you might have a look at the Sensory Integration Network, who could tell you much more about sensory processing disorder than I can. And there's also a great researcher called Olga Bagdashina, who's published books by Jessica Kingsley Publishers. Oh, I mean, she wrote the books, but Jessica Kingsley Publishers published them. So in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, when you get diagnosed as autistic, currently there's evidence base for hypersensitivity and hyposensitivity. So hypersensitivity is taking in too much information from one sense when compared to a non-autistic person, and that could vary. Like in one person, it might be that they generally have a kind of fairly just a standard response to sensory input, but when they're really stressed, they have hypersensitive hearing, for example. And then hyposensitive is when you're not getting enough information, and so that might be like when you avoid doing the washing up, because actually what happens is you can't tell how hot the water is and you burn yourself, and that's unpleasant, but you don't necessarily make the connection between the two because that's just the way you process things. So it doesn't necessarily have to be all the time, it can vary sense to sense. And this certainly these aren't the only two different sensory experiences that you can have. These are the two that are within the autism diagnostic protocol, if you like, but they're not the only two. It's just that these are the ones that have the evidence base. So Olga Bagdashina's work is a really great place to find out more information. It's worth doing a sensory audit, so thinking about all the different senses, like putting it into a table, and then thinking about the things within your space that stimulate them. So this is something that you could do after this talk. So as an example, in my room, I've got a window that's letting light through, and obviously I can see that, but also the light is, well, you're a physics student, so you know how light works. It's bouncing off all the different surfaces. My table is a bit shiny, so it's bouncing off that, and probably the computer screen, and then obviously my glasses. And so you know, you can start to drill down, I mean, not literally drill, but you can start to list very detailed, you know, ways that the sensory world is being experienced by an individual person. And as a physics department, you're probably, you know, the best suited for being able to do that. So thinking about the texture of the carpet and how that changes. Does the kitchen have like lino, and then, you know, the office, does that have a carpet, and, you know, the change from that, and if you're very sensitive you'd pick up on that change. So those kinds of things, it's really good to do that and to understand each person's individual sensory profile. Olga Bagdashina's book has got a sensory profile tool, and I think Olga's book is probably likely to be in the library, so you could get it out from the library and you could use the sensory It's like a sensory profile for each person, but also do a sensory audit, which is just a way of, consolidating your knowledge of a particular space, and maybe do it as a group, do it as a, like a Google Doc or something. So I also wanted to talk about executive dysfunction. So definitely a lot of people who have ADHD have problems of executive dysfunction, but there are also many autistic people who also have problems of executive dysfunction, and sometimes it can be really hard to explain what executive functioning is. And I would describe it as having a CEO in your brain that chooses what to do and when to do it and stuff. But my experience has been that that is still confusing to people. I'm somebody that has poor executive functioning, and so I put this slide together to try and explain about what difficulties with executive functioning might look like. So a person might take a lot longer to finish a task. So as a line manager, that could be, frustrating, but also a bit confusing, because that person could do that task, but somehow it seems to be taking a lot longer. A person who's often late, and could well be being told off very frequently for that, and that could cause all kinds of problems. Loses belongings, even things that are very important, like passports or computer files, that kind of thing. Can't work out what order to do things in. Is often in school the person that carries every single school book and their PE kit around with them every day. Forgets to eat and wash, and forgets things until the time when they need it. So, for example, I'd walk into orchestra and realise I'd forgotten my trumpet. The things that help me, and obviously everyone is different, and I'm 35 and it's taken me 35 years to build up these strategies, but as an example of things that can help executive functioning, and none of these things cost a lot or take a lot of time, but they're just things to be aware of. Having step-by-step details, so like step-by-step what to do, when to do it, how to do it. Not too many words, I'm dyslexic, too many words is going to confuse me, 1 or 2 words if I can get away with it. Plan far ahead, because I know that in the moment my brain will slow down, and it's like trying to think through treacle or something. I just know that I need to have as much planning ahead as I can, so that I know what to do and when to do it, so that if something goes wrong, I've got a bit of headspace to be able to figure out what to do next. Magnetic whiteboards, I have a lot of them in my house. Each of my projects has a magnetic whiteboard, and I write on it, and I find that's a good way of compartmentalizing information. I put KPIs on here. I hate jargon, but it was the only way to get it to fit on the slide. But what that stands for is key performance indicators. So essentially, what is it that I'm actually aiming for? So in my life, it's important to me to have a social life, to go and see my friends, to go to gigs. That's what I love to do. I love going to gigs. I love seeing new acts. I love seeing different instruments. I love being around people. I like to get drunk. I'm just like a regular person in that way, I suppose. But that's really, really important to me. And so if I can't do those things, so like last week, I had a very poor quality of life. I wasn't meeting my KPIs because I was ill. I had that big cold that everyone's been talking about. And so, I wasn't really meeting my KPI of having a social life. It's really important to me. But this week, I'm better, so I'll be able to do that. So that's really important. When I go out, having a clear list of everything that I need. So like down to like 7 pairs of socks, which is actually 14 socks, because you've got 2 feet, and 7 t-shirts, 3 pairs of jeans, etc. So like really precise. And so when you're giving instructions, giving that level of detail might be really important for that person, and also writing it down and having that clear method of communication. So like Google Jamboards might be a good way of putting communication in place, so that it's like an online whiteboard, but only the people that you invite can see it. So it might be a good way of asking questions and getting them answered and having specific information. All of this stuff takes practice, and it doesn't matter, how clever you are. That some people would say I was clever. That's not really a word I'd use to describe myself, but I still have many problems with very basic things, like choosing what clothes I want to wear in the morning, or executive functioning things that can really kind of snarl me up, or things like, for example, I was going to put a shirt on for this talk because I'd just been wearing a t-shirt today and I kind of felt I was a bit too informal. But I only remembered when Abby sent me the link to click on. So I clicked on the link and then I was off going, you know, to put my shirt on. But I could have done that, you know, when I'd come back from the shops earlier and then I'd be at the computer and ready. So it's that kind of thing. I aim to be 30 minutes early for everything because it gives me 30 minutes for if something goes wrong, I'm not going to be worrying about the time pressure because I know I've got 30 minutes. I have several alarms for the same thing because one alarm, oh, the alarm's going off. Two alarms, oh, maybe I'm supposed to do something. I have a professional organiser, so there are a lot of autistic people who might be described as hoarders, so people that collect lots of different things. And there's a hoarding scale created by a guy called Randy O'Frost, and this is quite a common issue. And I had a declutterer, a professional declutterer, come and help me. They don't like throw away all your stuff or anything, but they help you to learn to organise your space. So like I've got this great coloured set of shelves that has different cables in it. So each drawer has, you know, like USB-B, USB-A to C, USB, micro USB, etc. You know, so it's all there and all labelled and all neat. Whereas before I just had a massive box of cables. So they really helped me to do that sort of thing. And although those things, they might seem like really obvious, they're not really obvious when it's happening to you. And having other people telling you, oh, you've got a messy office, or this is messy, or that's messy, is not very helpful if you don't actually know what to do about it. Like, yeah, okay, you know that it should be tidier, but how do you do that? Like, it's just too many things. I found having a little label printer that I bought from Ryman's really helpful because I stick labels on everything, and it makes my friends laugh that everything has got labels, but because of my dyslexia, it's short words. So for example, in my bathroom, I've got lots of boxes of, you know, health things that are grouped by sort of ailments. So I've got a wounds box, a throat box, a tummy box, and so on. So I have all that stuff, and it has to also be like where I need it. I have temporary boxes, which are actually shoe boxes that I bought from IKEA that can fold flat. And then if the stuff that's on the table that shouldn't be there, it can go in a temporary box until I can get some help to reorganise it. Everything, like I was just saying, goes into categories. Everything should have a place. Things have to be close to where I need them, and I have to be able to see things for it to exist. It's called object permanence, but basically if I can't see it, it doesn't exist. So recently my wardrobes, well, my support worker told me that she thought my wardrobes were going to collapse, so I asked my landlord if I could have some more wardrobes, and they kind of just said, here's 200 quid, do what you want, just let us know. So what I did actually was I got a desk, because I thought, well, that's quite versatile, you can put things on top of it. But I also got two clothes rails so that I could see what clothes I had to choose from. That made a big difference. As I said, labels and everything, photos of what tidy actually looks like, so it's not just a sort of vague fuzzy concept, like it's not like something that we can't see, you know, like you can take a photo of it so you know, you understand what people's expectations are. And that can also be very important, you know, like when you're living with someone or when you're sharing a kitchen at work. Not taking too much on. I know that my capacity for wanting to do things and my actual capacity for doing them are two different things. I want to do everything, but I know that that is not actually possible, and I have to sort of self-preserve myself. I have to avoid burnout. I need time alone to decompress. Like, I find it being around people. I love people, but sometimes I just need to be by myself. And also I just need to kind of listen to my body. If I need to sleep, I need to sleep, and then I get up and work until 2 in the morning, and that works for me. When I go somewhere new, so Cray, I always used to get lost until I had a photo journey, which is just step-by-step photos of how you get somewhere. For certain pieces of work, I pay for somebody to be my in-person help. So my colleague Sarah Jane, I pay her, and she helps me just by being at the end of the phone. She knows the days that I'm travelling somewhere, and I pay her, and basically all she has to do is keep me calm and use her executive functioning to figure out what I should do if I get into trouble. Obviously working from home, it's a lot easier. I have to really, you know, not give myself a hard time, and this goes for any kind of disability or difference, is that, you know, like, it has its pluses and it has its minuses, and that's the same for everyone. Everyone's got their, you know, weaknesses and strengths, and it's important to accept that, and to accept your limits. So then, emotions, obviously this stuff that we're talking about can be very emotive, and also like when you're working, especially you know, when you're working within academia, sometimes that it can feel very stressful and big, you know, like if you're doing an ethics application, for example, and you're waiting for it to come back, or you've got a reviewer and you think the reviewer's comments are kind of a bit like, why are they saying that? Is silly, it doesn't make sense to me. Those kind of things can, you know, be difficult for anybody, but for autistic people they have the added difficulties of recognition and regulation. So you might want to have a look at the 5pointscale.com. But there are a lot of autistic people who have alexithymia, which is not being able to recognise your own emotions. So you still have emotions, but you just don't know which emotion it is that you're feeling at the time, and that can cause a lot of difficulties, because non-autistic people tend to find it very easy to know what emotions they're feeling. And when you can't then attend to your emotions, and sometimes an emotion will catch you out, like grief, for example. You might, you know, have had somebody die who's close to you, and it seems to other people like you feel nothing, and they feel like you're being really insensitive, but then you might actually like have a massive you know, like crying, you might start crying in a meeting, and to other people that seems totally inappropriate, but for some reason, for something inside you has triggered that. Autistic people can often be very associative thinkers, so things can link together by association instead of context. So an example, if you've got a room like a lecture theatre, and normally, you know, you do lectures in there, and you're either the person doing the lecturing, so you're talking and everyone's listening, or you're the person who's sitting and listening. That's one context, but that lecture theatre could also be used for like an end of term party or an end of semester party, and then the rules change because, you know, there's generally not just one person speaking when everyone else has to listen. You know, people are milling around and having tea and cake and all that stuff, alcohol, whatever, and so the rules are different, and for non-autistic people it's easy to make that change, but for autistic people, without someone pointing it out, sometimes that can be very confusing. And so sometimes like emotional things can be triggered by an association. So like in that example, the lecture theatre, the association is with teaching or learning, and so something that's said in a meeting could trigger an association with the person that's close to you that's died, and that could cause, you know, the upset. And it might be that, you know, that it, you know, to the rest of the world it has nothing to do with that meeting, but for that person it's very real right then, and they didn't pick up on the emotions building up because they didn't know, you know, like it's often like for them it feels like a light switch, but actually emotions build up over time. But if you have alexithymia, it makes it very difficult to pick up on that. So, you know, having strategies for emotional regulation and being able to talk about it and not being, you know, like so the extreme of having difficulties of emotions could be a meltdown or a shutdown. So a meltdown is when you get completely overwhelmed by things, and that could be shouting or throwing things or spitting. And a shutdown would be when you withdraw, so when you stop responding to your name. It is important you check that that isn't an epileptic absence with a neurologist, but there are a lot of autistic people who have shutdowns where they might pull a hood over their head, get under a table, remove themselves from a situation. And both of those things, meltdowns and shutdowns, are just when the person has got very overwhelmed. And it's important, you know, it's like an epileptic seizure. You can't choose it, it just happens sometimes, and it's important that people aren't made to feel bad about it, and also that you know that it can look different in different people. So that's my contact information. We've got like 40 minutes for questions. I don't quite know how I managed to get through all of that, but if there aren't questions, then I, you know, can sit here and talk to you. But you know, for me, I'm much more interested in the questions, but I also know that for you guys, this is very practical to make your department and maybe other departments in UCL more neurodiversity friendly. So I'm very keen for any questions.